All right, let's get into it. We're going to talk about a single sentence, just one sentence, in the Constitution that completely changed the game for America. Forever. Now, I want you to imagine this. What if paying federal income tax was actually unconstitutional? Sounds kind of crazy, right? Like something you'd hear today. But for a little while, the Supreme Court actually said it was. Yeah, and that kicked off this huge constitutional crisis that had only one solution. They had to change the Constitution itself. So to really get why this was such a massive deal, we got to rewind the clock. Let's go back to a time before the income tax even existed. Because believe it or not, the government had a major money problem, and it was basically written right into its own rulebook. Okay, so for most of American history, the government didn't have an income tax. Its main piggy bank was filled by tariffs. These are just taxes on stuff people bought, both imported and domestic. You can think of it like a giant national sales tax. But here's the catch. A tax like that really hits the poor and middle class the hardest, right? I mean, everyone's got to buy food and clothes. But for the super wealthy, it was just a tiny fraction of what they were worth. And this is where things get really weird. The original Constitution had this, well, you could call it a booby trap, called apportionment. It said that any direct tax, think a tax on property or land, had to be divided up among the states based on population, not on wealth. So get this. A poor state with a lot of people could end up with the exact same tax bill as a super rich state with the same number of people. It just made no sense, and it made the idea of a fair national income tax seem totally impossible. All right, so as we move into the Industrial Revolution, you've got these huge fortunes being made. Think railroad tycoons, steel magnates. And the gap between the rich and everyone else was getting wider and wider. The public started demanding a fair way to tax people. And all that pressure, it led to a massive showdown with the Supreme Court. So in 1894, Congress finally gives it a shot. They passed the first ever peacetime income tax to try and even things out. But it lasted for all of 1 year. The Supreme Court, in a super close 5-4 vote, just struck it down. And this wasn't just about one law. It was like the court put up a giant do not enter sign, a constitutional roadblock to any future income tax. Now, the court's reason was really specific, and this is the key part. They didn't say all income tax is illegal. No, they said that taxing income that comes from property, things like rent, stock dividends, interest, basically all the ways the richest people made their money, that was a direct tax. And because it was a direct tax, it fell under that crazy apportionment rule we talked about, which of course made it completely impractical to tax the wealthy in any meaningful way. And boy, were people mad. Even one of the Supreme Court justices, John Marshall Harlan, was absolutely furious. You can feel it in his dissent. He basically said the court had just created a special protected class for the super rich and had tied the government's hands. The public outrage was just massive. Okay, so the Supreme Court has slammed the door shut. What do you do? Well, the reformers realized if you can't win the game, you have to change the rules. And in this case, that meant changing the Constitution itself. And this wasn't some fringe idea. A really powerful coalition started to form. You had populists, Democrats, and even some breakaway Republicans. They called themselves insurgents. They all had the same message. Tariffs are unfair to working people, and the wealthy need to chip in more to build a modern country. This idea really took off, especially in the South and the West. But here's where the story gets a little sneaky. In 1909, President Taft proposes a compromise, which includes a constitutional amendment for an income tax. But get this, a lot of the conservative politicians who backed it thought they were being clever. They secretly believed there was no way it would ever get ratified by enough states. So their plan was to look like they were for reform while actually letting the amendment die on its own. A pretty cynical move, right? Well, that plan backfired. Big time. They totally misread the room. The political momentum was just too strong. And this cynical little trick? It ended up becoming one of the most important and powerful amendments to the entire Constitution. And there it is. On February 3rd, 1913, the 16th Amendment becomes law. Just 30 words. But these 30 words completely unlocked the federal income tax as we know it. And if you read them closely, you'll see it's a direct, surgical takedown of that old Supreme Court decision. So how does it actually do that? Well, it's pretty simple. First, it gives Congress the clear power to tax incomes. Second, it says they can tax income from whatever source derived. Boom. That gets rid of that whole debate about income from property versus income from a job. And third, and this is the killer blow, it says Congress can do it without apportionment. It directly removes that constitutional roadblock the Supreme Court had built. The change was, well, it was huge. Almost overnight, the government's funding model completely flipped. It went from being based on what people buy to being based on what people earn. And that created the financial engine for the modern federal government. We're talking about the money to fund everything from 2 world wars to Social Security and Medicare. But of course, the story doesn't just end in 1913. A lot of the same arguments against the income tax that you heard back then, you still hear them today from certain groups. The big difference now, the courts have heard them all before and they have shot them down, consistently, decisively. Okay, let's look at a few of these. One of the big ones is the claim that the 16th Amendment was never properly ratified, but legally, this is a non-starter. The Secretary of State officially certified it way back in 1913, and every single court that has ever looked at this has said the same thing. That certification is final. It's conclusive. End of story. All right, another common argument you'll hear is that the income tax violates the Fifth Amendment, that it's taking property without due process of law. Again, the Supreme Court shut this down over 100 years ago. They basically said, look, the Constitution can't give Congress the power to tax in one section and then immediately take that power away in another. It just doesn't work that way. And then there's maybe the most, let's call it creative argument of all, that having to pay taxes is a form of involuntary servitude, violating the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. As you can imagine, the courts have had basically zero patience for this one. They've called it far-fetched, frivolous, and just flat out without merit. And look, this isn't just some legal trivia. Making these arguments in court can have real consequences. The IRS and the courts can and do impose some pretty serious financial penalties for filing what they call frivolous tax returns or lawsuits. For example, in one case, a person was hit with a $4,000 penalty just for making these kinds of baseless claims. So, okay, the basic legality of the income tax is totally settled, but that doesn't mean the story is over. Not by a long shot. In fact, a really recent Supreme Court case shows that the debate over what this amendment actually means is still very much alive. So just in 2024, a case called Moore versus United States landed at the Supreme Court, and it dug up a fundamental 100-year-old question. What exactly is income? Specifically, do you have to have the cash in your hand for it to count? The case was about a specific tax on money that a foreign company had earned but hadn't yet paid out to its American investors. And what the court did here is fascinating. They found a very narrow way to decide the case. They upheld the tax, basically saying the company had realized the income, so it was okay for Congress to tax the shareholders. But, and this is the big but, they deliberately dodged the huge constitutional question of whether realization is always required. They basically kicked that can down the road for another day. So what does this all mean? It means that those 30 simple words from 1913 are still right at the heart of today's biggest arguments about wealth, fairness, and government power. As the nature of money itself changes, think digital assets, complex investments, that old question, what is income, is only going to get more important. The debate is definitely not over.